great to see you all. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. It's really a privilege of mine to be able to share what's really a kind of a new truth that's moving into history at this time. It's extremely exciting to me. I'm completely passionate about it because in some ways I've known it was coming all my life, a kind of the way that spiritual truth would eventually fall into place to provide a kind of a promise of a coming spiritual renaissance. It really feels like that is what is beginning to emerge now. And I've been anticipating and looking for and doing my best to position myself to serve some kind of significant spiritual emergence. And now with the emergence of evolutionary spirituality, this bright promise is really coming to pass, as I hope I'll be able to demonstrate in this talk. I'm going to go on for 45 or 50 minutes, and then the rest of the time we'll have questions and discussion. So I'm going to be talking about my new book, The Presence of the Infinite. Don't bother reading the chapter titles. I just put it up here to explain that if I were to probably take the best strategy for making it accessible, I'd pick one chapter and then explain that very carefully. But the part of this book that really excites me is the sort of the through line, the overall argument. So I'm going to sort of tease you with a lot of big ideas that follow this through line, and then I'm hoping that we can unpack some of them, the ones that you would like me to elaborate on, or questions that naturally come up in the course of the discussion. So it's really, the best part is really our discussion and questions afterwards. So I invite you to keep those in mind as I talk, and take a mental note, and we'll circle back to quite a few of these ideas. So evolutionary spirituality could also be called integral spirituality because it's the spiritual component of an emerging new transcendent but inclusive perspective known as the integral worldview. Integral and evolutionary are somewhat interchangeable as synonyms, but just as the integral worldview itself is sort of pushing off against postmodernism, kind of going beyond the counterculture to kind of re-include the heritage of Western civilization and all the accomplishments of previous stages, evolutionary spirituality is emerging out of, attempting to transcend while including what I call progressive spirituality. Progressive spirituality includes all the alternative, countercultural, Eastern, nature-based, earth-based, all the cultural milieu of alternative spirituality, which has emerged in the United States and elsewhere in the world, really beginning right after the 60s, beginning in the 1970s. We might be able to trace progressive spirituality all the way back to Emerson or Thoreau or Whitman. But it really becomes a significant demographic and a market, a part of the culture in the 70s. Progressive spirituality was formed from people trying to reclaim spirituality in a way that didn't involve a kind of regression to a previous form of religious spirituality. In other words, modernism as a worldview and a culture had broken away from the medieval feudalistic past, and it had effectively defined its politics in a way that wasn't dominated by religion. And that task of pushing away from the pathologies of religious spirituality was still an important goal and task for the emergence of progressive spirituality. Progressive spirituality for the last 50 years has sought to reclaim spirituality in ways that are distinct. They have a different feel and flavor from the traditional religious spirituality, which is the Judeo-Christian heritage of Western civilization. And progressive spirituality is something that I've personally lived through. I remember, in 1972, when I was 12 years old, I started getting and reading as many progressive spiritual books as I could. I remember reading Carlos Castaneda and The Projection of the Astral Body and The Aquarian Conspiracy. I mean, in the 70s, it was just starting to emerge and had a really fresh feel. Then progressive spirituality continued to emerge and develop as a cultural segment in the 80s. And then during the 90s, progressive spirituality really experienced a kind of fluorescence. It became a major market. Indeed, it was progressive spiritual books represented the largest category within the book industry, and it seemed like there was a New Age bookstore on every corner in the 90s. It was really a heady time, especially here in Boulder. It felt like the spiritual renaissance that I had been anticipating since my youth. But by the end of the 90s, we began to, myself and those of us who were directly participating in it, many of us began to get a sense of disappointment with progressive spirituality. That is, some of its very strengths, some of its accomplishments, burdened it with shortcomings, which sort of prevented it from supplying spiritual leadership for the larger culture. In other words, even today, even 15 years after the turn of the millennium, progressive spirituality remains very countercultural. You know, it's not taken seriously by the education establishment or by the media, or you know, there's a clear dialectical separation between the counterculture, represented by alternative spirituality and many other segments of the counterculture, and the mainstream, which can feel that this other culture kind of rejects it. You know, in other words, this representation of progressive spirituality as being more conscious has a hard time pulling the rest of the society into the cultural agreements of progressive spirituality. So progressive spirituality certainly has made many accomplishments which are worth noting, because without these accomplishments, the emergence of evolutionary spirituality would be impossible. Right? These include the rediscovery of the wisdom of the East, you know, bringing it to the West, and we've seen this in both Hinduism and Buddhism, have been very successful within progressive spirituality. Earth-based spirituality, paganism, eco-spirituality, feminine spirituality, embodied spirituality. One of the great strengths of progressive spirituality is how it's let 1,000 flowers bloom. Its sort of welcoming pluralism has really created one of the most beautiful forms of spiritual culture that's ever appeared. And so there are many beautiful things about it that we need to carry forward and build on as we try to create or participate in the emergence of a more inclusive and transcendent form of spirituality, which evolutionary spirituality represents. You know, among the fact that progressive spirituality hasn't really had a larger influence on the society, at least minimally, is part of that is that on the flip side of its welcoming pluralism is a sort of anything goes relativism that allows some of the most sophisticated and mature forms of spirituality to be sort of lumped together in a general culture with many forms that are pseudo-scientific or infected by magical thinking or intense commercialism. I mean, there's lots of downsides of progressive spirituality. But evolutionary spirituality is one of the main ways that it's able to push off against the shortcomings of progressive spirituality and offer a kind of spirituality that I think, as I argue in the book, can provide a more agreeable form of social solidarity while retaining pluralism. It's the way evolutionary spirituality helps to harmonize science and spirit on their own terms. You know, in other words, this has been a project of progressive spirituality, but evolutionary spirituality goes farther because it's able to, in a sense, bring back the truth element. You know, modernism is so concerned about what's true, it's so intensely rational, that one of the ways that progressive spirituality was able to transcend it was to sort of tone down the need for philosophical analysis or intense concerns for what was true or philosophically coherent. Progressive spirituality was more about beauty, more about goodness. But now, evolutionary spirituality can reclaim this philosophical element, which is an essential bridge between the scientific and the spiritual. The book focuses primarily on spiritual experience itself. There's a variety of themes, but spiritual experience is the main focus, because in some ways it's by expanding our grasp of what spiritual experience is and how it works that evolutionary spirituality makes its major advance. So what is spiritual experience? As I argue in the book, it's the presence of the infinite in the finite. Now, of course, spirit is more than simply infinity, right? Different spiritual traditions can take the concept further in their own directions, either theistic or non-dual. But there's a widespread agreement among many different spiritual paths that whatever spirit is, it has this quality of being infinite. In some ways, it sort of remains outside of time and space. And when we have a spiritual experience in all the many ways we can, part of the way we can understand that experience is as the finite becoming transparent to the infinite that's sort of upholding the universe from within. It's as if in a spiritual experience, phenomenal reality is rendered partially diaphanous. So there's a sort of a shining through of this sort of hyper-lucid quality. In the book, I describe many different kinds of spiritual experience. I mean, certainly there's the direct experience of ultimate reality, which can be life-changing and, for some even earth-shattering. And ultimate reality, as we'll come to later in the talk here, includes both a non-dual experience of absolute oneness, as well as an experience of presence. That's not quite the same as an absolute oneness. There's also group forms of spiritual experience that's embodied in our physical bodies. Psychedelic spiritual experience has been a major lever for cultural evolution. I talk about that in the book. But the kind of spiritual experience that evolutionary spirituality really brings to our understanding of what spiritual experience is, the main sort of breakthrough that evolutionary spirituality brings is a deeper understanding of the spiritual experience that's available in the beautiful, the true, and the good. Now, beauty, truth, and goodness, evolutionary spirituality could also be called beauty, truth, and goodness spirituality. These have been recognized since antiquity by many different kinds of philosophy as in some ways representing the most intrinsic values that humans are capable of experiencing. They're really ends in themselves. Even though they're good for many things, they're also intrinsically valuable unto themselves. We might make a list of intrinsic values. They might include goodness, truth, and beauty. We could also add love and freedom and justice. We could make a long list of values which we consider to be intrinsic unto themselves. But there's something very special about this triad of beauty, truth, and goodness. One of the ways they can be understood as primary is the analogy of primary colors. Just on your computer screen, how RGB, red, green, and blue, are able to reproduce all the colors in the visible spectrum. The beautiful, the true, and the good, in a sense, represent kind of capstone qualities that are found at the heart of larger dimensions of value. So, for example, beauty is the capstone quality of the entire aesthetic dimension of delicious pleasure that's available in our experience. Truth might be understood as representing the capstone value in a kind of a rational dimension of greater meaning and expanding grip on what's real. And goodness is in some ways the capstone value of a moral dimension of excellence or quality, wherein relationships are the primary currency of that value's activity. The beautiful, the true, and the good, they're kind of a conceptual cathedral, as I demonstrate throughout the book, both by argument and example. The best way to understand this sort of great attractor of evolutionary development, this sort of source of value gravity in the universe, is by considering it like a jewel of truth with many facets. So we can sort of talk about the different facets of what the beautiful, the true, and the good are. One way of understanding them as aliveness, or as the flowering of the real, your heart's desire, your greatest hopes, the most intense form of your own self-actualization. The beautiful, the true, and the good are really what that's about. We could also think of them as the comprehensible elements of divinity. They're almost like rays of ultimate reality that shine into the finite. And they're also, in a sense, handles on spirit. Not only can we experience the beautiful, the true, and the good, but unlike other kinds of spiritual experience, these forms are directly usable in our work. In other words, whatever we do in the world, when we are guided by the truth of this spiritual energy that's contained in these sort of flashing glimpses of perfection in the finite universe, we can supercharge our work with more beauty, truth, and goodness, and thereby, whatever we're doing in the world, we can bring spiritual experience to our fellows by supercharging and making what we do more beautiful, true, and good. And that's why, in a sense, these values are like a circuit. When we experience them and we create them, they're circuited through us like a form of spiritual energy. And when we use the practice of bringing the beautiful, the true, and the good into our work in the world, into our family, into our lives, into our everyday lifestyle, we open the aperture to receive more of this spiritual energy of every kind. But the beautiful, the true, and the good as forms of spiritual experience, they're not just instrumentally valuable. Again, they're also intrinsically valuable. And part of the way we can appreciate the intrinsic value of these forms of spiritual energy is in the way they communicate messages of love, both in the form of assurances and in the form of instructions, for how we can perfect the universe in our own small corner of it. That's one of the major messages of evolutionary spirituality, which I'll explain further in a moment, and that is this idea of perfecting the universe step by step, value by value, is part of our purpose for being in the world as agents of evolution. So this idea of the beautiful, the true, and the good as messages of love, when we think about beauty, we can think about all the delicious ways that we can receive pleasure in the world. All the beauty is, as Whitehead said, the final contentment of the eros of the universe. To the extent that something's beautiful, its evolution can proceed no further. The beauty itself is a little expression of perfection, fleeting, but there in our reality. And in those moments of delicious pleasure that we receive from beauty, we may hear the message, feel loved. Beauty makes us feel loved. It's a true message that you can hear. Likewise, the message of truth, in the sense that the universe is intelligible, that the way is open for our discovery, that as we learn more of what's true, we understand more of what's real and we become more real ourselves. So just as beauty tells us to feel love, the message of truth might be interpreted as grow, develop, seek. And in the realm of morality, in the realm of human relationships, as I mentioned, the message of goodness is love others. So these messages of spirit, in a sense, are guiding us step by step. I mentioned that progressive spirituality has, in a sense, bracketed the truth for evolutionarily appropriate reasons, right? One of its strengths is that it welcomes all forms. And sometimes the most valuable kind of spirituality is not necessarily the most true. It could be delivering spiritual experience in the realm of beauty or goodness. But ultimately, the shortcoming of progressive spirituality, its magical thinking, its pseudoscience, provides our point of departure. All truth is partial. That's part of what makes it more of a direction than a thing. The beautiful, the true, and the good are neither absolute nor relative. They're sort of both and neither, in the sense that we're discovering these realities more and more as our consciousness evolves. And as we have the spiritual experiences of the beautiful, the true, and the good, these are one of the things that evolve our consciousness more effectively than any other kind of experience, which I'll also come to at the end. The idea that truth is a spiritual practice is one of the big breakthroughs of evolutionary spirituality. As I said, it reclaims truth and not just conceptual philosophy, but when practiced as a way of gaining a greater hold on spiritual reality, truth itself is a very deep spiritual experience. It's intrinsically valuable unto itself. Which leads us to this idea of how evolutionary spirituality can enhance and develop our understanding of spiritual experience and our ability to have spiritual experience more abundantly and use it more effectively in our work. One of the ways is this word, the hermeneutic circle. That's a philosophical term which describes how these three concepts, in a sense, work together. Spiritual experience is had primarily through spiritual practice, right? And spiritual practice broadly conceived. Spiritual practice, in turn, in a sense, relies on spiritual teachings. Even the most minimally doctrinal forms of spiritual practice ultimately are engaging some kind of spiritual teaching in the frame of the practice that they're recommending. So any one of these parts of the hermeneutic circle can be significantly enhanced by any of the other parts. So because evolutionary spirituality brings an important new truth, this is sort of the juice of it, the new truth. It expands spiritual teachings in a way that leads to increased power in spiritual practice, which then results in greater, deeper spiritual experience, which then increases our hold on spiritual truth itself. So in the book, chapter 2, I describe what I call the spiritual teachings of evolution. It's only recently, in the last few decades, that we've come to understand through science that everything in the universe is evolving. It might even be accurate to say that the universe is evolution happening, right? Ever since the Big Bang, which is now a well-confirmed scientific fact, 13.8 billion years ago, time itself began. I mean, matter, energy, time, space, this all flares forth in an instant, not that long ago, only 3 times older than the Earth itself. And since that time, evolution has been continuing all the way into our present moment, which I'll explain in a second. But a truth this big is not just a matter of scientific facts. There's spiritual truth in our new and broadened understanding of the universe. And appropriately interpreting that truth is one of the great gifts that's made available to those who practice evolutionary spirituality. So I'm going to go through 5 basic tenets of evolutionary spiritual truth, in other words, the spiritual teachings of evolution. The first is that the structure of emergence reveals value creation. And what I mean by this is that ever since the Big Bang, shortly after the Big Bang, most of the universe was just the debris from the initial Big Bang, mostly hydrogen atoms with a little bit of helium. And since that time, since the debris of the hydrogen gas, for the last 13 billion years, something more keeps coming from something less. We can see it in the periodic table of elements, which is a kind of a fossil record of this structure of emergence in the cosmological realm. We can see it in the biological tree of life. We can even see it in our own cultural consciousness. It's as if there have been, in a sense, 3 Big Bangs. The first Big Bang is the beginning of time and space, and that sets off a whole sequence of structural emergences that then sort of leads to a kind of a second Big Bang, if you will. The appearance of life is more than just another layer in this structure of emergence. There's something entirely new that comes into the universe with life, and that is this intentionality to survive and reproduce. Even the most primitive forms of life can't be reduced merely to matter because matter doesn't strive. Matter can't fail to achieve its goals, but all of life can. Life is a river that runs uphill. And so it's kind of a new form of reality that does represent an authentic second Big Bang. And all of the accomplishments, if you will, of each one of these major stages in the structure of emergence are online and functioning now within our bodies. If you think about hydrogen atoms, those are only created one time in the history of the universe, at the Big Bang. All the hydrogen in the universe was created at the Big Bang and none since. And the hydrogen, which is the foundation of our water molecules, which is the foundation of our body, the main ingredient, it's like an accomplishment that's here with us. And so in some ways, we embody the entire structural sequence of emergence, both cosmological and biological in our bodies. And then, about 250,000 years ago, there was a third Big Bang, the emergence of a new kind of evolution that, again, can't be conflated or reduced to biological or cosmological evolution. And this, of course, is the appearance of human consciousness. And humans, even though we have animal bodies, even though we're physical beings, when we emerge, something else comes into the universe. And that's a higher form of purpose. We have a sort of free will purpose that allows us to imagine how things could be better. Animal needs can be satisfied, but as soon as humans satisfy one level of needs, they awaken to a higher level of needs. And this is what's allowed us to evolve our culture, this freedom to imagine how things could be better. It's an emergent element of the universe which creates this whole new domain of evolution. And yet, the evolution of human consciousness and culture is real evolution. It's not just an analogy of evolution. Even though it can't be conflated, or it's not the same thing as biological evolution, it's extending the structure of emergence where something more keeps coming from something less. And because we embody evolution structure in our physical bodies and in our minds, this also points to how we embody the purpose of evolution itself. This is tenet number 2 of the spiritual teachings of evolution. And this involves what's called the evolutionary impulse. As I said, animals, what distinguishes life from non-life is this purpose to survive and reproduce. It's an urge, a sexual urge, a fear-based survival urge. And as animals evolve up the tree of life, their urges become more developed. They include the biological urges for social needs and familial relationships. But with the emergence of humans, this evolutionary purpose, this evolutionary impulse, it reaches into a whole new octave of development, a whole new realm wherein not only can we feel with our animal cousins all of our biological urges, but we can also feel the urge to self-actualize, the urge to give our gift, the urge to live up to our potential, the urge to be good people and to do the best we can. These impulses within us are part of this larger evolutionary impulse. Just as we embody evolution's structure, we also embody evolution's purpose and its impulse. In other words, we have a direct phenomenological experience of what evolution wants, in a way. And so when we feel these higher impulses to self-actualization, the eros of a better way, we're tapping into the gravity of the beautiful, the true, and the good, which gains traction on our minds. We're pulled by it. And so if we want to know evolution's larger purpose, all we really have to do is look within ourselves. Our purposes are its purposes. And this is shown by the fact that purpose is in the universe. Whether, we can argue whether evolution has a purpose. Certainly some people refute that. But purpose is the major thing that's emerging with the second Big Bang and the third Big Bang, new forms of purpose. So a very important spiritual teaching of evolution is that, in a sense, we are agents of evolution. I mentioned the beautiful, the true, and the good. I talked about that quite a bit. But the role that these intrinsic values, that all forms of intrinsic value, and especially the most intrinsic values, the role these play in the evolution of the universe is that they're kind of pulling evolution forward from the inside through their influence on consciousness, right? Surviving and reproducing can be understood as a primitive form of goodness that all life is striving for. And then we are able to get a deeper, wider understanding of this gravity, this value gravity, if you will. That's why the beautiful, the true, and the good can be understood as directions of evolution. They're sort of, as I mentioned, they're like the rays of the infinite that are pulling us, that are luring us. Whitehead defined evolution as an increase in the ability to experience what is intrinsically valuable. And that consciousness-centric definition of evolution helps us appreciate how intrinsic value, the presence of the infinite in the finite, is influencing evolution as a kind of a final cause or a gravity. When we think about goodness, we can understand it as perfection's plumb line, if you will. The way we can understand the central pull of this value gravity on evolution. A fourth tenet is this very important concept of free will. In other words, from the perspective of evolutionary spirituality, the universe doesn't really make sense unless humans have a role to play in the cosmic economy, if you will. That is, evolution has a purpose, we can feel its purpose, we have a purpose for being in the universe. And as I argue in the book, that purpose is to experience and choose what's relatively more perfect by our own lights, to rediscover the infinite through our own experience, to add to the existential nature of pure being within this realm of becoming. We're sort of bringing perfection back into the finite. And our freedom can be understood like, evolutionary psychology has shown how our biology and our evolutionary inheritance has such a huge effect on our minds. We're so largely determined by our physiology. Likewise, we've come to understand how much culture is determinative in our consciousness. These two huge deterministic influences of biology and culture make it so that some people have very little free will or very little choice. They're sort of just tossed around by these larger deterministic currents. But I think every human has within between these huge influences of culture and biology, There's a tiny little bit of freedom, a tiny opening. And as our consciousness evolves, this freedom actually widens. Abraham Maslow actually wrote that self-actualized people have more free will. And in some ways, we can see that it's the freedom itself, which is the presence of the infinite in the finite. The spirit that indwells us as humans gives us that freedom, which in a sense can be understood as an organ of perception for values. We're able to choose authentic moral goodness because we could do otherwise. That's what makes the moral choice real, is that it's freely chosen, or at least, partially, relatively freely chosen. So this free will, even though it's being attacked right now by a secular spirituality or, a sort of a-spirituality, for good reason, because it is a kind of a supernatural power that humans possess. And if you were to take it seriously and recognize that this is an uncaused cause within our minds that we hold sovereign, that sort of undoes a materialistic worldview. The fifth spiritual teaching of evolution is known as panentheism. And that's the idea that spirit is both transcendent of the finite universe and also immanent within. That is, it's the same infinity that in a sense precedes, if you'll pardon the oxymoron, precedes the Big Bang. That is, the finite became a part of the larger encompassing infinite universe 13.8 billion years ago. But even though the finite is an area or a clearing, wherein the infinite's been partially removed, where time and space, can exist, and human freedom can have a field of action, this idea that spirit is also immanent, that when we think about the beautiful, the true, and the good as the presence of the infinite and the finite, if you think about a beautiful person or a beautiful scene in nature, at their height, the experience of this kind of beauty is it's almost shimmering. It's sort of numinous in the way that there's something about the beauty that's sort of glowing. And when we understand this phenomenon as literally the finite becoming thin or transparent, to this infinite in a form that we can see as beauty. Likewise, the truth in our minds is a little form of perfection, a little flashing glimpse of the infinite, in our mental realm. And in the realm of relationships, when things are just right, when there's a loving heart, when people care about each other, the infinite is present through goodness in that relationship space. So I could go on quite a bit about panentheism, which is explained and described and praised in the book. But the reason that it's useful here and that I include it as one of the 5 major tenets of evolutionary spirituality is the way that this pattern of infinite and finite, or absolute and relative, or even creator and creature, the being and the becoming, these 2 very important aspects of our experience, of our reality, condition almost every step of our spiritual growth. So this leads to a theoretical sidebar in the presentation, which is important for appreciating evolutionary spirituality's big breakthrough, which I'm about to come to. But before I can describe that, I want to talk about polarity theory, right? Which is the idea that in our experience, in the circumstances of life in this universe, we constantly encounter existential, indestructible polarities. And so often people conceive of a polarity as good and bad. And that would be a positive, negative kind of a polarity, and there's plenty of those. But the kind of polarities that are indicated in this theory are polarities which are positive. That is, both sides of a circumstance or event, each side is creating value. But ideally, one side needs the other, that the 2 are interdependent, that they're related to each other in a way that they have to true each other up or take turns in their value creation as they moderate each other. So examples of these positive polarities that we encounter and that are sort of existential, we can include freedom and order, or mercy and justice, or competition and cooperation, science and spirituality, beauty and truth. Even male and female, in a sense, are a positive, interdependent polarity. And the thing about these polarities is that they're procreative, that they have the tension between them and the way that they have to alternate in their value creation helps us identify them as portals for growth or engines of evolution. And the cosmic part of this recognition of polarities is that they're all mirroring this larger structure of being and becoming. It's like the master macro structure of the universe, the primordial polarity of being and becoming, is refracted throughout the universe, like self-similarly or fractally, in the way that we encounter them daily when we're trying to create value. And when we're instructed by the truth that these interdependent polarities are engines of evolution, they lead to a practice, which is a very powerful practice of evolutionary spirituality, which I describe in the book. For example, within progressive culture, the polarity of cooperation and competition is often viewed as a problem to be solved rather than a system to be managed, right? Cooperation good, competition bad. And that's understandable given that progressive postmodernism is trying to push off against the shortcomings of modernism, which itself is highly competitive, pathologically so in many cases. So it's natural that they would prefer and celebrate cooperation. But ultimately, because cooperation and competition are interdependent, if we side with one to the complete exclusion of the other, pathology, or at least stagnation, is the ultimate result. So, cooperation without any kind of individual excellence or original creativity can become groupthink, it can become bureaucratic. Likewise, competition without any cooperation or larger sense of being in it together can lead to sort of dog-eat-dog hostility. So either by themselves is not adequate, but when they're brought together as a system, they can really true each other up and work together as like two legs of value creation. So this idea of polarities as systems of evolution is nicely captured by these Lorenz attractors, which are from chaos or complexity theory. And they show how in certain systems, two areas are sort of working together. And this idea of interdependent polarities points to a very deep discovery that evolutionary spirituality is making when it comes to our understanding of what's ultimately real. I think it's possible to experience ultimate reality because, again, according to panentheism, ultimate reality, or the infinite, or the non-dual one, or God, or whatever word we want to use to talk about ultimate reality, is that it's not only the circumference and the container, and it's also the center of every quark, the center of our higher selves. In a sense, the ultimate reality is nearer to us than our own breath. So our ability to experience it is not some cosmic speculation. It's really the heart of spiritual experience. Ultimately, something is ultimately real. The totality exists necessarily. Some people consider ultimacy in terms of only their own self-interest. Right? Others think of ultimate reality as the God of history, as taught by the Abrahamic religions. According to scientific understandings, ultimate reality is simply the physical totality of the universe. And within progressive spirituality, ultimate reality is conceived in a wide variety of ways. But one of the most powerful accomplishments of progressive spirituality is the way it's really brought forward the non-dual understanding of ultimate reality. Now, non-duality is difficult to define or describe, but it's more than a concept. It's certainly a conceptual teaching about what's ultimately real. That is, there's just one thing. It's all one. And any perception of a separation is, in a sense, an illusion. And the sense of our interconnectedness and the fact that we're all essentially part of the same thing, we're all the same person having the same experience in a way, or unique experiences of the same one entity, that's a very powerful proposition that's directly experiential. In other words, non-duality, in a sense, is discovered through an attractor basin of spiritual experience, another concept from complexity theory, and that is that if you engage non-dual practices, especially meditation, you're going to have spiritual experiences. And at the depth, or the apogee of the spiritual experience that's available within this non-dual attractor basin, is this idea of samadhi, or as it's known in the scientific literature, the unitive experience. And this unitive experience has been reported by saints and sages, down through the ages as, in some ways, the height of their realization. This sort of hyper-real, hyper-lucid experience in which subject and object collapse, and the universe is simply just one thing. And the mystics who've brought back reports of this non-dual experience have really had a convincing sense of that they've touched the ultimate, and that the ultimate is one. And so one of the ways that progressive spirituality has really accomplished a lot is by sort of finding this entire complex of spiritual understanding that's really at the heart of Buddhism, it's at the heart of Advaita Vedanta Hinduism, and there are many mystical expressions of other spiritual paths that have encountered this non-dual attractor basin and had samadhi experiences. And so progressive spirituality has, in a sense, consolidated many different non-dual traditions into a larger umbrella of this agreement about non-duality as being the ultimate reality. Eckhart Tolle is probably the most famous proponent of this non-dual agreement. But Ken Wilber and other very sophisticated teachers also recognize non-duality as a sort of the highest description of ultimate reality. But the thing about spiritual truth is because it's not a thing, it's not in time and space, it's not a static proposition. There's always more truth. It's a vector. It's a ray toward greater perfection. So whatever truth, even the highest truth that we can know, is always partial, right? Truth is like a ladder of distinctions, and there's always more truth to be found because we're far from perfect knowledge of the real at this point. And so one of the ways that evolutionary spirituality can include while transcending progressive spirituality is to notice how the partialities that are inherent in the truth teachings of non-duality, how those open up into a wider and more inclusive understanding of what's ultimately real. And that includes this idea of the love of the Creator. This itself is a similar kind of deep spiritual experience with its own attractor basin. In other words, just like if you practice meditation, you're going to have an experience eventually. If you're a stalwart practitioner, you can get to the samadhi experience. Likewise, if you practice the presence of God, if you have faith, if you pray, if you do these time-honored theistic practices, there is an apogee, a spiritual experience that's deeply confirmative of the truth teaching that the universe has been created and upheld by a form of ultimate reality that has self-awareness. And one of the ways that evolutionary spirituality is able to reclaim this idea of a loving creator in ways that don't regress back to mythic, anthropocentric versions of ultimate reality is that it's two dialectical steps removed from religious spirituality. In other words, modernism pushes off against religious spirituality. Postmodernism reclaims spirituality in all the ways that are not theistic. But this idea that consciousness is in the nature of ultimate reality, that even from a non-dual perspective, if we are it, if we represent the whole, and evolutionary spirituality sort of shows that we do, if we are the whole and we're conscious, if we have self-awareness, if we can love and be loved as individuals, then so does the whole also possess these qualities. And so through evolutionary spirituality, we're able to recognize that these aren't necessarily different paths to the top of the same mountain. That there's a very important interdependent polarity within both spiritual experience and the world body of spiritual teachings. But because evolutionary spirituality can work with polarities and see them as engines of evolution, we can bring these two major attractor basins of spiritual experience together in a way that can true each other up, right? We can have non-dual experience more abundantly. We can have an experience of the love of God more abundantly through this complementary practice that integrates non-duality and theism in a transcendent and inclusive new whole that involves bringing together the spiritual truths of non-duality and theism, bringing together the spiritual practices of non-duality and theism, and bringing together the spiritual experiences of absolute oneness and the love of the Creator. And I can tell you that the practices, now I'd have to get didactic, bullet points, to get through what I describe in chapter 7 of the book, is how one pole, with the evolutionary spirituality, one pole can be practiced with reference to the other. Like at the traditional level of spirituality, typically people inherit their religion from their culture and they really don't have a choice about it. Within progressive spirituality, there's a wide variety of spiritual paths available, but the typical approach is to find a form of spirituality that resonates best and make the truth of that path one's own truth. And that's, has achieved a lot of spiritual progress by itself. But at the evolutionary level, once we're informed by this larger truth of this existential polarity in spiritual experience, and the systemic nature, the procreative tension that exists in this larger dynamic structure, we can understand how practicing one pole with rigor, going deeply into it at the evolutionary level, means making room for the white dot within the black wave, and vice versa. In other words, that the Taoism's well-respected yin-yang symbol points to this interdependent polarity feature wherein the heart of one is the other. So as we think about what it might mean to practice theism within a non-dual context, or practice non-duality within a theistic context, we can see how while certainly adopting the practices of faith or adopting the practices of meditation are an obvious way that one can include the other pole in the pole that they may find themselves most resonant with. But there's other ways in which the very truth practice of this new understanding can open up our ability to receive spiritual experience. So for example, in some of its expressions at least, non-duality is expressed as absolute nothingness, right? As complete emptiness. The founder of the Kyoto school of non-dual philosophy, Kotaro Nishida, he talked about ultimate reality as not even nothing, right? Just absolute nothingness, as much of a void as you could possibly imagine. And when I think about that, I get a sinking sense of cosmic vertigo. But in some ways, this idea of absolute nothingness has been extremely useful in my own understanding of the love of God. In other words, it's sort of a critique that brings kind of beginner's mind. It sort of washes away all the conceptual baggage that gets attached and allows for the unmediated appreciation of spiritual experience. But many spiritual teachers, sensing the partiality of the non-dual, or this conception of absolute nothingness by itself, have tried to move towards the middle. So for example, venerable teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, who's an important ally in evolutionary spirituality, he describes sunyata, or emptiness, as interbeing, right? So it's the thing that connects us all, the stuff by which we're all one. And that's, I think, not all wrong. I mean, there's important truths in this notion of interbeing. But it's certainly not the same as this notion of absolute nothingness. Likewise, on the theistic side, some progressive Christian teachers like Shelby Spong have argued that we should give up on the anthropocentric notions of a conscious creator and recognize God as a creative principle or a self-organizing tendency. And again, that's not all wrong either. But as we move toward the middle, from the extreme of an absolute self-aware God that can know us and love us as individuals, who lives inside of us and knows us as original persons, that concept in its fullness it complements symmetrically the opposite. So we can understand that we don't have to move to the middle to overcome the partiality of one extreme or the other. We can have both in their fullness. Just like when you have a masculine and feminine, there's nothing wrong with androgyny. It's perfectly fine, but it eliminates the procreative tension. And what we've got now in this revelation of this structure of ultimate reality, at least it's perceived within time and space by finite creatures like us, is that these are like the two legs of our spiritual progress. And now we can have them both abundantly without being confused by the lesser truth that they're just simply paths to the top of the same mountain. We can have a deeper understanding of what's ultimately real through this truth. Of course, this polarity that I'm describing is just a shadow of a higher unity. But rather than just claim that it's just simple oneness, you have to have a more sophisticated concept that includes wholeness. In other words, this evolution of the yin-yang symbol shows how the two can come together that are sort of the three that are two that are one. And we can even begin to play with these ancient symbols and recognize that as I said, this structure of the universe of being and becoming is refracted fractally throughout the universe, as the playful fractal yin-yang demonstrates. And this same principle is illustrated by the flower, which is the cover of the book, which I think this calla lily really does represent in some ways this expression of this pattern of the infinite within the finite. So I just want to conclude with one more idea that's the last chapter of the book, and then we'll have a discussion about this, hopefully. And that is where evolutionary spirituality, not only can it benefit us by giving us new ways of receiving spiritual experience and sharing spiritual experience with others, in some ways it lends itself to a method, an approach that can literally evolve consciousness. If we think about every one of the stages of consciousness and culture that are recognized by integral philosophy, traditional, modernist, postmodern, every one of these stages emerged with a very important method that in some ways embodied or exemplified the truths that were at the heart of that worldview's value system, right? The traditional worldview emerged with the method of writing, which allowed it to consolidate human organization and civilization beyond kinship ties. And it, through written scripture and law and history, writing was an extremely powerful method that demonstrated and enacted the power of the traditional worldview. Likewise, within modernism, one of the major components that allowed modernism to emerge in the Enlightenment, and now, in a sense, for good and bad, represent a sort of a global civilization, was the scientific method. Right? The scientific method was a sort of an embodiment of modernity's rationality that allowed early modernists to see more deeply into reality and manipulate it in a way that could improve the human condition immensely. Right? The scientific method led to scientific medicine, which has improved the human condition perhaps more than any other single factor in history. So if this emergence of this integral or evolutionary stage really is to live up to its promise as the next great phase of human history, then inevitably history predicts that it'll have a method, a powerful method, by which it can see more deeply into reality and improve the human condition immensely. And so as I explore in the book, I think that method will be a way of gently persuading people to adopt a wider scope of values. In other words, a way of moving people up the spiral of development, from traditionalism to modernism, from modernism to postmodernism, from postmodernism into an integral perspective. And this technique, this method, comes from the central insight that what raises consciousness most effectively, most gently, most persuasively, is spiritual experience itself. Especially when spiritual experience is expanded to include this idea of the beautiful, the true, and the good. If we look at history, we can see that these transitions from traditionalism to modernism in the Enlightenment, or from modernism to postmodernism like in the 60s, it was the new truth, the new beauty, and the new ideals of morality that acted as the lure, that pulled people into these higher stages. And so we can understand that transformative works of culture that embody the values of the next higher stage, that can be skillfully presented to and given to people at the stage that they're in, that these higher values connect with existential problems that each stage creates as it succeeds. So the traditional stage creates, it inherits a chaotic world of warlords and violence, but it creates a degree of order and a degree of civilization. But the downside is that it creates oppression and a caste system. And this is an existential problem that can't be solved at the level that created it, as Einstein famously said that some problems can't be solved at the same level of thinking that created them. So the values of modernism connect to that existential problem of the traditional stage by offering a wider, deeper understanding of reality and a new social form of organization where careers are open to talent and people can become middle class and become prosperous. But this very success creates its own kind of existential problem, which is people get all the status and material that modernism has to offer, and they look around and say, is this all there is? It's just not satisfying. In other words, modernism can be hollow because it doesn't have the deep meaning that people crave even when they become rich and famous or whatever they're striving for within a modernist worldview. So again, that's an existential problem for which postmodernism, the values of postmodernism offer a solution, a more holistic lifestyle, a more meaningful reclamation of spirituality, in a non-traditional way. Likewise, at the postmodern level, an existential problem arises, and that is that even though postmodernists have achieved this more inclusive and transcendent kind of value, even though they understand how fragile the environment is, how important social justice is, all the values of postmodernism represent an authentic advance. But at this time in history, those values don't have the power to persuade the larger society in politically significant numbers. And so an existential problem of postmodernism is that it is politically impotent. That even though it's shouting from the rooftops about the problem of climate change, it's not convincing the rest of the society in a timely and effective way. And that's an existential problem that exists at a level for which the values of this evolutionary or integral worldview can actually solve that. It can reintegrate the larger society and create forms of political agreement and political will that postmodernism is unable to supply. In some ways, that's the focus of this think tank that Jeff mentioned. But the basic idea, the takeaway from this presentation, and what I hope we can talk a lot about, is this idea that the infinite, however we may define it, however our spiritual path may elaborate upon the infinity of spirit, that the infinite is, in a sense, present to us in the finite. And this is, by itself, this very simple but profound truth is one of the ways that science and spirituality can become more harmonized. So thank you for that. So not only would I love your questions, but I'd love any objections or challenges or anything that there's a scratch on the record. Just let me know and we can explore that. Yes.
Can you point out some of the possible fallacies or shadows of living in integral or evolutionary meme? You talked about how memes evolve,
right,
and then they fix something,
right,
or bring more order, but they have their own traps.
Sure, of course.
So,
right, what's the pathology that's inevitably going to arise as the integral worldview comes into its own?
Right, or possibilities.
Sure. Well, the first part of the answer is that the pathologies appear as a direct result of the successes. Right? So think about this idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Right? When a new worldview emerges, it's sort of this. It's emerging as a synthesis. It's where it's in its fresh phase, where its most beautiful art, and music often appear, where it's getting the most done, where there's so much to do that there's a season of synthesis where it's in its kind of golden time. But then, as it accomplishes more and becomes more of an establishment force, the synthesis kind of decays into a more stale thesis of itself, which points to an antithesis that's waiting as the next step. So because this integral or evolutionary perspective is just emerging now, it hasn't even really begun to achieve its synthetic possibilities for growth, and so the pathologies that will inevitably appear as it becomes successful haven't become apparent yet. However, we can certainly speculate about what those might be, and I think that as I argue in Integral Consciousness, my 2007 book, inevitably there will be post-integral consciousness, but that, according to this cultural, I see these more as cultural stages than psychological stages, and from a cultural perspective, postmodernism is still in the process of emerging, and so the postmodern or integral is going to take a while, but eventually, of course, it's not the end of history. There will be a time when there's an emergence of a next great phase, or for lack of a better word, the post-integral. And one of the thinkers who I think comes closest to being a kind of a proto post-integralist is Martin Heidegger, the famous German existentialist philosopher. And Heidegger is very dense and difficult to understand. I mean, he adds 500 words to the language because he's going into new territory that there are no words to describe. But Heidegger's complaint, in a sense, is that all philosophy since Plato has been too much concerned with concepts, that concepts have mediated the difference between us and our perception of reality. They like tiled over our perceptions of reality with concepts so that the unmediated experience of being is clouded by philosophy. So Heidegger's project is to rid philosophy of all conceptual apparatus and just get at what is being itself. Right? So this integral perspective is highly conceptual, and as I mentioned, it's sort of reclaiming the truth. It's philosophical, trying to bridge science and spirit with philosophy. So it's inevitably making abundant use of concepts, stages, patterns, values. It's all very conceptual. And so maybe we'll be able to make a lot of progress with that, but eventually we'll say, we're going with Heidegger, and we want to just get rid of the concepts and be there with the being. At least that maybe is part of an answer, and you can read about it some more in Integral Consciousness. Thanks for asking that. Yeah, over here.
Hi.
Hi.
In my case, I was born-again Christian until I was like 16, and then I had this big talk with God, and he didn't say anything, and I said, well, you know where to find me. I'd love to hear from you. And then I became, like I said, I'll just try to figure it out on my own. So I went and studied Buddhism and meditated for 40 years. And as I experienced more and more emptiness and nothingness, what sort of became apparent was that, Christ is the ground of reality, or that appeared that way, and I would often have experiences of what I call the beloved, and the beloved actually turned out to be Christ, but it goes back and forth, and so I guess my point is that I think that spiritual experience is the kingpin of this whole evolutionary pursuit, and in my case, Eastern and Western sort of came together through each other. And so what I think is most primary and most important is, to find the quickest shortcuts to spiritual experience that are non-denominational, non-religious, whatever. That if we can get people to have spiritual experience, that seems like that transcends the whole thought world and the whole philosophical realm, and it gives people an actual experience of beauty, love, and truth. So,
Sure.
So I'm just wondering if you have any favorite shortcuts to recommend, and what you think about that whole idea of the primacy of spiritual experience.
Right. Well, I certainly agree that spiritual experience is primary in that hermeneutic circle, of teachings and practices. I think that the spirituality of the future will be based primarily on experience, the direct experience of spirit. But our understanding of what spiritual experience is, I think, is a very important method or even a shortcut for having spiritual experience. As I mentioned, that truth is a spiritual practice. I mean, when we're instructed by the truth, that truth itself is a form of spirit. When we connect with it in the way that it's bringing us reality in a way that makes us more real, that this light of truth can enhance every kind of spiritual experience we may pursue, whether it's meditative spiritual experience or faith-based spiritual experience or psychedelic spiritual experience. There's all these different categories of spiritual experience. Each of them can be entirely rewarding and energizing in their own way. I think that in some ways that some kinds of spiritual experience are only had through dedicated practice that takes many, many years. But I think in some ways the practice itself is delivering part of the benefits of the ultimate spiritual experience, the discipline and the habit of being in a practice and dedicating yourself, your intentionality toward the practice, is part of what builds up into the samadhi experience that you may ultimately have. So the shortcut wouldn't be a shortcut because you wouldn't have the full samadhi experience if you didn't have the practice that got you there. Likewise, when it comes to faith, you've had these experiences, as you mentioned, where you just experienced, the beloved, and it was, immediate and clear. But there's also a way in which the experience of that love itself is a practice for which you wouldn't want to take a shortcut. It's like if you're going for a hike and through a beautiful place, you don't want to cut it short. You want to enjoy the whole hike. And the same goes with the practice, for example, of faith. One of my favorite quotes is from the French philosopher Blaise Pascal. He says that human things must be known to be loved, but divine things must be loved to be known. So this practice of loving what is, the practice of loving the source of yourself and the source of reality, loving God, feeling God's presence, or whatever word works for you in terms of this idea of the ultimate reality, self-awareness, that experience of love that you have opens the channels of receiving that love. So the practice is an integral part of the experience that you wouldn't want to miss, right? Now, in terms of a shortcut, Houston Smith has described psychedelic spiritual experience as a sort of a ersatz shortcut to mystical experience that are better achieved through, intentional practices. But in my experience, psychedelic spiritual experience is its own category. Although there's overlap with mysticism and other kinds of spirituality, I was first sort of initiated into spiritual experience at an early age through psychedelics. And, it's a chemical trigger of deep spiritual experience. And although I would hesitate to use the word shortcut, I do recommend ayahuasca to people as a way of having a deep spiritual experience that you can't get any other way. So I'll kind of go out on a limb and say that in this context. Yes.
Okay, I don't know if this is a question, but I just had an insight and I wanted your thoughts. So I was thinking about, you were talking about the truth. And so do you feel like the truth, there's like a universal truth? Or do you feel that as a collective, hold on, I'm trying to think of how to word this, but yeah, I hate talking
This
in
is
mics,
a great
but-
question. Go on.
So is it more like, because I'm thinking, for me, I feel like, is it more about as individuals on our finite experience of the infinite, that we are honest about our feelings and our truth, and that may overlap, it may not, but that is almost like building the puzzle piece of our, in a more integrated consciousness as we all accept our own truth and everyone else's with complete reverence.
Right. So that's wonderful, deeply philosophical. It's like a fastball down the middle I just can't swing at. So let me give that a try. If we go back to what I said regarding the beautiful, the true, and the good as vectors of perfection, the directions of evolution, and how they're not absolute or relative, in the sense they're not just whatever we think they are, and neither are they fixed or given, right? That we're discovering what's relatively more perfect, step by step, in both goodness, beauty, and truth, in our own experience, by our own lights. It's because we are discovering these things, and these are the rungs of the ladder of our ascent. As we create our path from the dirt to paradise, as Ken Wilber likes to say, we're creating our own line of truth, beauty, and goodness that leads back to the center of the universe, or wherever the summit of our spiritual ascent may be conceived. So in that sense, each one of us has our own original, unique path of truth, right? Because we're each original. That's the polarity, is that we're all one, and that we're all original. And that, in a sense, disrupts the unity of truth, because how could both be truth at the same time? Again, Houston Smith says that the opposite of a small truth is a falsehood, but the opposite of a great truth is an equal and opposite truth. So we're all one, and we're all original. And that originality part of us gives us a particular, unique, individual gift that we bring to the larger universe in our ascent, through time. So in a sense, beauty, truth, and goodness are customized, to our own experience and by our own choices, by our own lights. And yet at the same time, they're part of the infinite. Right? And the infinite is ultimate and one by definition. So it's paradoxically original and paradoxically, absolute and relative, but both and neither. Does that help? Does that confuse things? It's something to ponder, like a koan, for sure. But we don't need to think of truth as certainly absolute. There's not one truth. I mean, humanity has a long way to go in our path of truth. I mean, what's real, we're far from knowing it or seeing it clearly at this point in history, and we may never really see it clearly until we transcend time itself. But, here in history, here in time, we're growing by coming to know what's more real. We're growing literally in truth. And in that way, we're adding to it and bringing something unique to it. Yes?
Thank you. A couple comments and then a question. The first comment was about spiritual connection and practices. I just came from John Young's talk over Pioneers. He talked about bird language and an incredible world opening up. And what was so astonishing was seeing that there were 4 generations in the room. There were kids listening, teenagers, college kids, and grandmothers and great-grandmothers. He's on to something, and you could feel it in the room. There was something happening. So that might be a path. The second comment was, I really appreciate your talk about the masculine and the feminine and how the deistic practice doesn't have to necessarily integrate or come together. You don't have to come to the middle. That was very helpful, and I really appreciate it.
There's an existential challenge.
Yes.
That we don't want to eliminate
Exactly.
that procreative tension.
Yeah. The question I have, or if you could talk more about, and this is getting into kind of nerdy philosophical, why theistic versus deistic or another istic? When you say theistic, I'm thinking one thing, right, and deistic says something else. Can you talk more about the nature of what you're talking about?
Clear that up, sure.
Thank you.
So in theology, the 2 words that are the most accurate labels for these 2 attractor basins that I've been describing is known as pantheism and panentheism. Those words are so close and confusing that there's just no way I could get away with using those either in the book or in a presentation like that. But that's sort of the most accurate description. If you look those up in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, there's a nice entry on both, right? And the difference, and why, at least my arguments, that the spiritual teachings of evolution themselves disclose that becoming is not an illusion, that nature and history have value, and that, that there is pure being, and it's certainly something to be experienced and sought and lived for, but also we don't want to try to collapse the becoming into the being because it has spiritual value as well. Now, I'm not trying to say that the theistic or the panentheistic, this recognition of God, is necessarily the same thing as becoming, with the non-dual the same thing as being, but there's all these, these are concepts, and so they become flattened when we talk about them in language and think about them in finite terms. But again, they're part of the facets of a diamond, which are a larger concept that eludes our immediate apprehension, but which we can begin to understand philosophically, through a spiritual philosophy that can bring the facets together so we can see the larger shape of the diamond as a whole. So deism, that's another thing altogether. That was a version of Enlightenment thought, like Thomas Jefferson was a deist. Deism is an early breaking away from Christianity, where they thought that God is just the designer, that he winds up the universe and then steps back, and there's no involvement. And that was a natural way to try to demythologize or the overly supernatural elements that were a huge part of the mythic thinking that modernism was trying to transcend. Deism was one of the ways that they tried to have God without all the mythic stuff at the same time. But deism is not really a live form of spirituality now. I guess there's people who identify that way. But theism, however, is a significant form of spirituality in the traditional, the modern, the postmodern, and an important part of what's emerging with the evolutionary level. So this understanding that ultimate reality has self-awareness and that ultimate reality is loving, those are the cornerstones of theism, just as absolute oneness or nothingness are the cornerstones of the non-dual. So there's no adequate, perfect terminology, but calling it non-dual and theistic is better than making up words, I think, at this point. Sure. Yes?
Speak on the theory that everything happens as it's supposed to.
Well, I mean, that sort of goes to the paradoxical and dicey nature of trying to understand what time is, right? If everything happens as it's supposed to, in a way, that in some ways it's a thesis of determinism, like everything's already happened. Everything is happening at once, right? That physicists talk about what's known as the block universe, that time is all happening at once, that it's spread out linearly in a sequence from our perception, but if we could have a God's eye view, if you will, it would all be, the future and the past would all just be one moment, right? But there are a lot of philosophical problems with the idea of the block universe, and the most difficult one is that it eliminates human freedom. You know, we all have this direct phenomenological experience of freedom, as I spoke of, but more than our experience of our freedom of choice is the larger spiritual truth of the essential role that our freedom plays in the cosmic economy. So if everything's supposed to happen as it is, then that means evil and suffering and all the horrible things in the world. You know, we live in a world of trouble and suffering. Is it supposed to happen that way? I think that the universe, that the finite universe is this clearing or opening, as I mentioned, which perfection's been removed, right? So that we can have the freedom of rediscovering it, bringing the infinite back into the finite as our job in the cosmic economy. But if we're just going along for the ride and nothing bad can happen, or if something bad happens that was supposed to happen, then there's some way in which it makes us, it takes away the urgency to make the world a better place, right? If we say that, you know, children aren't dying, that's not supposed to happen, right? War is not supposed to happen. All the horrible evil in the world, that's not supposed to be there, but it's our job to ameliorate it, right? So I resist that idea. I think that at the same time, though, there is a mysterious form of providence, you know, by which, you know, synchronicities occur, and the more we grow spiritually, the more we attract synchronicities in our direction, you know? And so I wouldn't want to just say that it's completely random or that there is no larger guidance, but I don't think as humans we can fully attempt to understand it. And I think that it's tempting to sort of think, oh, it's all supposed to happen like it's supposed to happen, and then I don't really have to try very hard or care very much. I think it eliminates our essential responsibility, our sense of responsibility for perfecting the universe. So that's why I would resist that conclusion in terms of the immediate truth that we have to work with. Okay. Sure. Yes?
So, hi. So I'd kind of like to inject into this conversation the understandings that neurobiology is bringing in. And one of the ones I've just been recently fascinated with, there's a great PBS series that's out now that is talking about how the mind is simply a mediator for this ultimate reality. I mean, nothing exists except for our perception of it, or how it's mediated by our senses.
Right, Eagleman. I've seen the series.
Eagleman, yeah. Sure. I mean, it sort of starts opening concepts and realize, and in the context of this discussion, I'm kind of understanding that as what spiritual practice has been reaching for, which is sort of a dissolution of identity, to be able to touch that ephemeral truth or reality. And then what occurs to me, again, in the context of this discussion, is that as these understandings come online, first of all, it's a great, because it's scientific and it's scientifically provable and all this, it's a great mediator for these concepts and that intersection of spirituality and science that may uplift culture. And at the same time, it's very possibly creating new structures in the brain that will also uplift us, as you know, evolutionarily, and in as someone was speaking, you know, what are the shortcuts? And you spoke to just this understanding is already a shortcut, and I'm just sort of pointing to, and look, science is saying the same thing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So.
Well, let me respond to that in a couple of ways. One, I think that the advances in neuroscience are, you know, wonderful extension of science, and I think the more they can find out about the brain, the better. I think that the natural tendency of scientists, especially scientists like Eagleman, right, is they They want to claim more for the science than it actually claims, and so that they extend their claims through sort of philosophical sleight of hand. And so in that series, he makes all kinds of statements that are not scientific, that are an expression of his atheistic belief system. And it's sort of masquerading as brain science when it's just a philosophical conclusion designed to support an atheistic worldview. So it's very important not to discount, neurology, but understand that they will pretend to explain everything if they can, or if you let them, or if we don't know any better. I think the realization that we construct reality in our experience and that we can't know reality as it is, I think that's a very important philosophical pole, but it's just one pole. The other pole is that we're not only makers of the real, we're also finders of the real. Finders. We don't just make it. It's just not all constructed. There's something veridical in our experience that we are experiencing, and part of the proof of that is that we can agree about what's real. In other words, our agreements themselves are what enacts reality in some ways more than our neurological experience. So in the book, I talk about the challenges to the notion of experience. What is it? What is spiritual experience when we know that we can't just think about it as representationally, like it's the myth of the given, like spirit is just there, an object to be seen objectively. But we have to also avoid the opposite conclusion, that it's all hopelessly subjective, that we're just making it up as we go along, and that there's nothing real out there to be found. Again, that's that when you have an interdependent polarity and you side with one side, it leads you off a cliff in some ways. And I think that strict constructivism or strong constructivism, however it's termed, sort of divorces us from reality in ways that I think are unhealthy. And I think the very spiritual growth itself is proof that we can come to know what's real by increasing measure. Yes?
I'm not really quite sure how to put this, but you put an image up that talked about the non-dual and the love of God, which reminded me of the jnana and the bhakti paths of Hinduism,
Sure.
which I'm most familiar with. And because of my experience of going fairly obsessively into those two directions my entire life, I am really familiar with the shadow sides of both of those paths. And I'm curious what you think are the new pathways as a result of the shadow sides of going deeply into those paths. Because I see your book as a bridge. I see it as looking at the whole thing, the East, the West. And I haven't read it yet, but I can't wait to. But it's so hard to emerge from those pathways because of those shadow sides, because it disconnects you from the world to such a large degree, that I imagine the evolutionary perspective, which I'm just getting into, and the integral perspective, is the way to kind of pull you back into the world in that integral way. But I'm curious what this book, because I was here for your last book, we both were for your last book.
Thanks very much.
What this book is showing you in terms of the new pathways. Does that make any sense?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
Let me make a few comments around that. One is that Hinduism is a very wonderful and exemplary religion because it's divided in some ways down the middle between the theistic and the non-dual. Right? I mean, even 1,000 years ago, we have Shankara, who's the founder of Advaita Vedanta, and then you have Ramanuja, who's not as well known in the West, but who championed a kind of a panentheistic version of non-duality. Sri Aurobindo, in some ways, is the inheritor of Ramanuja's teaching. And likewise, he didn't get along very well with Ramana Maharshi, who was the inheritor of Shankara's teaching, right? That Maharshi repudiated Aurobindo's evolutionary premises. And so, again, they didn't have a language or way of thinking about interdependent polarities as systems of evolution because the spiritual teachings of evolution were not really available. I mean, Aurobindo got evolution much more than Maharshi, but I think that the inevitable shadow of both is inherent in their partiality, right? I mean, their truth, and to the extent that they're standing as truth and are experiential as truth, as I say, truth by definition is there's always more. It's always true but partial. So the very partiality is the most immediate way we can appreciate the shadow of both, right? And so in some ways, the cure for one's shadow is the truth of the other. They both can mitigate each other's shadows or potential downsides by being practiced together in a way that one informs the other. In the book, I also have a section on the shadow of the beautiful, the true, and the good. I talk about it in terms of both the psychological shadow and as well as what's known in philosophy as the problem of evil, which I talked about a little bit a moment ago. And that's a whole kind of lecture in itself. It's sort of, I hesitate to just jump into it in a short answer, but I do encourage you to read it and email me if you want to correspond a little bit about these shadow elements, because it's certainly something that I'm interested in and I want to explore more, especially with people who can sense that. So maybe a couple more questions? Yes, sir.
Point of clarification. You speak about the evolution of consciousness,
yes.
And in my understanding, consciousness, it is, and so when you're speaking about the evolution of consciousness, are you talking about the faceting of the lens through which consciousness experiences?
Right.
That's what you're saying.
Well,
you're not actually talking about the evolution of consciousness itself.
Let me respond, if I may. There are many different definitions of consciousness, right? If we hold consciousness to be the only real thing, like the universe is simply consciousness, from some perspectives we could say that doesn't evolve. The way I define consciousness for purposes of my discussion in the book is a kind of common sense definition of our sentient subjectivity. Our memories, our sense of self, our awareness, our thinking, our thoughts, the internal realm of our awakening mental presence as it's influenced by our subconscious mind and our memories and all kinds of other factors that we may not be consciously aware of. But when I think about human consciousness, one of the ways that I think that it clearly can be seen to evolve is as our conceptions of value evolve. So the human brain may have evolved a little bit in the last 50,000 years, but the consciousness of the people who are using this brain has expanded significantly. So one of the ways that consciousness has evolved, for example, is in the realm of those who are worthy of moral consideration. Like in the tribal settings, those worthy of moral consideration are our blood kin. Right? The people from other tribes are the enemy, right? And then with the emergence of traditional consciousness, we draw the circle of moral consideration to include all those who are in the same religion, right?
How is that not just the evolution of value?
Well, that is because our consciousness of those who are our brothers grows, right? Like it's not just the consciousness of what's real. Our consciousness becomes more real as we understand what's more real. So maybe it's a semantic definition. We'd have to, get specific about your definition of consciousness and my definition of consciousness. But I really think that when you recognize that everyone in the world, deserves your moral respect, that your concept of truth likewise has grown, from magical to mythical to rational to holistic, that these are not just growths in values, they're growth in what we can see, they're growth in what's inside of us, that the interiority of ourselves is actually getting larger and evolving. And indeed, that's one of the central principles of integral philosophy, is that consciousness and culture are part of what's evolving in the universe, and that it's real evolution. So our subjectivity is evolving. Maybe that's another word we could substitute that wouldn't trip you up as much as the word consciousness, which has been used to designate other meanings that may not lend themselves to this idea of evolution so directly. But I do think that as our values evolve and our scope of understanding and our scope of compassion evolves, that we do become larger, and then that's authentic evolution. Sure. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. I'm someone who's studied Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, for many years, and I've had an interest in integral theory. But I don't know, I guess I just wanted to make a few points, because I've kind of struggled with this in my own life, especially the idea of evolution. Obviously I can see evolution biologically, politically, culturally, but in terms of philosophy and spirituality, it's hard, because the truth, good, and beauty come from Plato, right?
Well, they come from God, I would argue.
They come from God.
But I mean, that it's the beautiful, the true, and the good are not simply Platonic, right? Sri Aurobindo champions the beautiful,
Right.
the true, and the good. Whitehead, even, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh writes about the beautiful, the true, and the good. So it's simply not a Platonic
I mean, it's not
concept.
simply Platonic, but these ideas seem like they've been talked about for so long.
Well, but we're not using Platonic conceptions. We've grown out of this idea of static Platonic forms. As I've described the beautiful, the true, and the good, they're like the directions of evolution, not static things. So our conception of these values has grown out of a pre-modern Platonic idea of value realism.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I can see that. I guess, like, as an example, like when you had that diagram with the love of God and nothingness, like all my Buddhist teachers always emphasize so much that ultimate reality is the union of love and emptiness or truth. So I appreciate that diagram, but I don't think it's representative of, like, to say Buddhism is talking about nothingness as like just an absence. Like, that would be a mistake from that tradition's.
Well, certainly, I'm not arguing with Buddhism proper. I'm talking about non-duality as it's come to be the most mature expression of progressive spirituality, as represented by many non-dual teachers who've kind of combined Hinduism and Buddhism into this one larger non-dual teaching. But even setting that aside, a very sophisticated philosopher of non-duality, David Loy, who actually lives here in Boulder, wrote a very excellent book in, I think it was '88, published by Yale University Press. And he really gets into talking about the philosophy, the philosophical implications of non-duality and how we can understand them more deeply. And even he, who's a strong proponent of non-duality, he's a Zen Buddhist in terms of his orientation, even he acknowledges the problem of love within a non-dual ontology. Because even though, compassion is certainly the cornerstone of Buddhist teachings in many important ways, if you think about the bodhisattva, the realized bodhisattva has, as part of his or her realization, this sort of strong determination and compassion. And there's something about compassion and indeed love, which is irreducibly relational. It's a relationship. If there's only one thing, it's hard to ground the idea of love philosophically within the teaching that there's just one thing and all separation is an illusion. Because as soon as you say all separation is an illusion, then that has to mean that love is an illusion, because love is irreducibly relational. And that's why this idea of simple non-duality by itself, it's evidently partial, because we have these other very important spiritual truths which challenge it. So we don't have to make it wrong or say that it's lower. We can say that, whoa, that's got a very important challenge to the theistic. So it's not as if we simply settle for paradox or say that it's both and. We recognize that each one of these kinds of truth teachings holds the moral high ground by turns. So, you could say that, that there's the love of God, but you can also say that there's just one thing. And you could say that there's just one thing, and you could say, but there's also a relationship. And you could say that there's being and there's also becoming. And so it's like a movie. It's not a still picture. You can't, it's like a false rest to try to bring them together and find a place where they connect permanently. Because they don't connect permanently. It's like a magnet. You try to find the center, it throws you to one side or the other. And so that's what's dynamic about this new truth of these polar attractor basins of spiritual experience. And because this love of God is ungrounded at best and denied at worst within most forms of non-dual teaching, it gives us an opportunity to supplement that teaching without threatening it or erasing it. And I think that's one of the breakthroughs of evolutionary spirituality.
Okay, thanks. I guess one thing I'm seeing with that is the evolutionary spirituality, maybe the West in general, right, has this place for the individual that maybe some of these non-dual teachings from the East downplay.
Well, it's hard to ground the idea of free will in the concept of no self, right? I mean, Thich Nhat Hanh does a memorable job, but most of the non-dual teachers, like A.H. Almas, declare that free will is an illusion, because that's a natural consequence of the idea that the idea of a separate self is an illusion, right? You have to say there's no free will if you say there's no self. But that doesn't have to be untrue. You don't have to say, well, no, there's free will, therefore the no self is not right. No self can be fully true. We can be all one thing, and at the same time have this, equal and opposite truth, and that is we're original, as I said. And that's, that is a koan, and it does have procreative tension for further spiritual development.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, one more question. Is there one more? Oh, there's not. Thank you so much for coming.